Assalamu alaikum. This is Vodcast number 7. Inshallah, we'll cover chapters 13 and 14, which will leave only one more chapter to be covered, chapter 15. So, chapter 13 is called The Decisive Actions in the Shadows. This chapter covers a number of different topics. The first one is Dar al-Arqam. So, this was the first Islamic center as well as the first sanctuary of the Muslims during the very early days of Islam. So, it was originally the home of Al-Arqam bin Abil Arqam bin Asad, who accepted Islam just after Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, so one of the very first Muslims. So during that time, the Muslims faced a lot of persecution and torment from the Quraysh, and because their numbers were small, they really weren't able to defend themselves well, and so suffered quite a bit. And unfortunately, this meant that they didn't really have a safe place where they could learn about Islam in peace without being persecuted, or where the Prophet ﷺ could reveal his message, the revelations, without basically in a safe place. They were lacking this. So in the 5th year of prophethood, Muhammad ﷺ took the home of Al-Arqam, which was located near As-Safa, as a temporary center for Islamic activities. And this is where the new Muslims began to meet secretly, where many people embraced the faith for the first time, and where they would be able to come to hear the revelation of the Quran from Muhammad ﷺ. So this home became, a place. Al-Arqam gave this place a sadaqah in the name of his son, and subhanallah, it became a very vital part of the community and nourished many young people and old people who were embracing Islam for the first time. Alright, so one of the greatest sales in history. This is the next topic, and this is about SUHAYB bin SINAN. So about 20 years before the Prophet ﷺ's mission, there was a wealthy Arab governor named Sinan bin Malik who lived in the Persian city of Uballa in Iraq. He had a son named SUHAYB who was blonde-haired, which is a bit unusual for Arabs. Unfortunately, when he was about 5 years old, he was captured by the Byzantine raiders and actually sold as a slave in the markets of Constantinople. So he ended up in the Roman Empire and spent much of his childhood growing up in Constantinople away from his family. So he ended up learning Greek and forgetting a lot of his Arabic, but he never forgot his roots. He never forgot the fact that he was Arab, and he always wanted to go back. So when he got a little bit older, he eventually escaped and made it all the way to Mecca, where he became a client of a rich merchant, and then later became a prosperous merchant himself. Because of his blonde hair, which was unusual, and the fact that he had a Roman accent when he spoke, he became known as SUHAYB al-Rumi, which is meaning like SUHAYB the Roman. And then after the Prophet ﷺ, received his first revelations and started preaching Islam, SUHAYB went to Dar al-Arqam and actually accepted Islam there in the very early days with Ammar bin Yasir, who we didn't talk about Ammar specifically, but we did talk about his mother Sumayya in the last video, and if you're curious, you can go back to that. But she was the first female martyr in the history of Islam. Alright. So SUHAYB quickly, became integrated into the community and was very involved with the Muslims. He, unfortunately, during the first Hijrah, he was caught and imprisoned and ended up having to barter all of his riches for freedom. So like I mentioned, he was a prosperous merchant and he had a lot of riches, but he had to give it all away. When Muhammad ﷺ heard about this, he was quite pleased and actually told him, "Your transaction has been fruitful, O Abu Yahya," which was a nickname of SUHAYB. And then there's also an ayah from the Quran revealed after this happened, and to kind of praise his actions, and I'm just gonna play that here. As always, I'll just let you read the translation along by yourself while I play it.
ومن الناس من يشري نفسه ابتغاء مرضات الله والله رؤوف بالعباد.
Okay, so then SUHAYB survived past the life of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and then during the Khilafah of Umar radiallahu anhu, he was also there, and towards the end of his life, actually, when Umar radiallahu anhu was stabbed, this was obviously a very kind of a chaotic time for the Muslims, and Umar radiallahu anhu chose Suhaib to be the kind of temporary leader of the Ummah, while the other 6 leading Sahaba decided on a new leader. So I just point this out because it shows how respected and honored he was in the community, despite kind of his unusual background, not even, really growing up in Arab lands. He was known as Suhaib al-Rumi originally, but quickly integrated and became a very important part of the community and very trusted. Many historians consider him to be the forerunner of the Roman or European Muslims as well. So he definitely played an important role. Alright, so the next topic is about the first Muslim who entered Mecca reciting the Talbiyah. So this is a pretty beautiful story actually. So in the year 6 AH, there was a man named THUMAMAH bin Uthal of Banu Hanifa at Al-Yamama, who was one of 8 leaders who received a letter from the Prophet ﷺ that was basically a about the welcoming letter and introductory letter about the message of Islam. So he was a very powerful leader, and is always one of the ones that was first a recipient of this. Unfortunately, Thumamah himself harbored a very strong hatred of Islam in the early days, and actually had a strong desire to kill the Prophet ﷺ and end his mission as quickly as possible. So that year, he decided to go to Mecca in order to perform Umrah, not for Islam, but for the idols. Unfortunately for him, on the way to Mecca, he was taken prisoner by a Muslim military party who brought him to Medina instead, where there was a pretty established Muslim community at the time. So there he was brought to Medina, and because people knew who he was and knew his hatred for Islam and for the Prophet ﷺ, he was tied up to a pole in the masjid and kind of left there for a little bit. So every day, Thumamah would barter for his freedom, tried to, offer different types of things because he was a very wealthy man and very powerful leader. He tried to offer many different things for his freedom, but Muhammad ﷺ didn't accept. He just kind of left him there. And he stayed in the masjid there for 3 days. People kind of took care of his needs, gave him food, and they just let him watch the Muslims as they came in and out of the masjid and prayed 5 times a day and went about their daily business. He just let Thumamah observe all that. So after the 3rd day, Prophet ﷺ kind of surprised him by just releasing him from the pole and just telling him that he can go. And Thumamah was a bit surprised, but he was excited. So obviously, he got up and initially just set off. He was planning to go back to Mecca and to complete his Umrah. However, after he left, soon after, something kind of hit him, and he actually turned around and ended up embracing Islam, which was a huge, surprise for everybody, including himself probably, because he used to be one of these staunch enemies and this huge hatred. And he himself actually said, "By Allah, there is no face more hated to me than you, O Muhammad ﷺ, but now you are the most beloved to me." So, subhanAllah, it really just shows how when Allah decides to guide someone to Islam, like, no one can stop him, and the transformation is really incredible to watch. So now being Muslim, he then continued on to Mecca, but decided to perform Umrah for Allah this time, instead of the idols. So he entered Mecca and he was shouting the Talbiyah, which was the first time that the Talbiyah was recited in this way, and now it continues to be recited to this day. So he was the first one to start that tradition. That's one of his legacies. He was nearly killed by the Quraysh when they saw him, when they realized that there's a Muslim guy coming to Mecca. They almost killed him, but then when they realized who he was, they left him alone because they remembered that he was a very important leader of this very powerful tribe, and that killing him or in any way harming him would bring more danger to themselves. So they left him alone and let him go on with the Umrah. Later on, Thumamah became an important part of the Muslim community, and he actually at one point declared a boycott on all supplies going to Mecca in order to kind of hurt the Quraysh. And this boycott was so successful that the Quraysh ended up begging the Prophet ﷺ to have it lifted. And so they eventually did, and this led to the opening of Mecca. So another really huge impact that Thumamah made for the Muslim community. Alright, and then chapter 14, this is about AL-TUFAYL bin Amr al-DAWSI. So AL-TUFAYL was a well-known Arab leader who was famous for good work and good character, and really had an important role in feeding the poor and destitute populations and assisting other people in distress. So he was also a master poet and had tremendous influence over people just by his beautiful words and sensitive expressions. In the early Meccan period, he at one point left his village in Tihama for Mecca, where the Quraysh informed him that there was this man named Muhammad Islam who had disrespected their religion and had bewitched people with his captivating speech. So At-Tufayl was like many other people upset by these words or by the story of the Prophet ﷺ, and he decided to stick cotton in his ears in order to avoid hearing these supposedly bewitching words. However, he was not really able to keep his ears completely plugged, and soon was very soon captivated by the prayers and speech, as well as the mannerisms of the Prophet ﷺ. There was one incident where he heard the Prophet ﷺ recite Surah Al-Ikhlas and Surah Al-Falaq, and he remarked, "I swear by Allah, I had never heard such beautiful words before, neither was a more noble or just mission ever described to me." So he said these and very quickly thereafter embraced Islam because he was just so moved he couldn't help himself. So Tufail, after becoming Muslim, eventually returned to Tihama and was advised by the Prophet ﷺ to kind of spread the message of Islam and try to convert more people. He was successful in convincing his father and wife to become Muslim, but other than that, he only was influential on a couple other people in his tribe, and so he was a bit frustrated by this because he felt like he was working very hard and nothing was happening from his efforts. So he came back to the Prophet ﷺ and told him about his frustrating experience, and the Prophet ﷺ heard about this, and he prayed and asked for their guidance for the people of Daus, and he told Tufail, "Go back to your people, befriend them, treat them gently, and invite them to Islam." So he just really encouraged him to continue trying and not to give up so easily. So Tufail reluctantly did go back. SubhanAllah, by the time of Khaybar, about 80 families had come from his village in Tihama to Medina and to announce their Islam. So he eventually did become more successful. So after that time, Tufail stayed with the Prophet ﷺ in Medina until the liberation of Mecca, and at that time he was again sent to Tihama to try to spread the message of Islam further among the people that still remained non-believers. At that time, Tufail went back and he actually ended up setting fire to one of their major idols, and after that happened, the whole tribe embraced Islam all at once, which looking back to when he first went to Tihama, this is like an unbelievable occurrence that went from only a few people being convinced to eventually the whole tribe being convinced by the grace and mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Alright, so review questions. What was the importance of Dar al-Arqam? So this was the most important sanctuary and center for Muslims during the early time period, and it was very valuable because during that time they were very much persecuted by the Quraysh, and they were very weak as a group because they were so small in number. So this served as a huge, very vital part of their community and allowed them to gain strength and knowledge about Islam in those very, very early days. What was the significance of the actions of THUMAMAH when he returned to his people? So I think it's just notable that, well, first of all, like the story of how he converted is just very, very amazing and inspiring. But after that, it's amazing what a great impact he made on the Muslims. He was the one to first recite the Talbiyah, which is like a huge legacy that we continue today. It's also amazing how effective he was in the boycott against the Quraysh, and then those actions eventually led to the opening of Mecca so that the Muslims could again return there. So that was a huge significance. And then what can we learn about Dawah from Tufail's life? I think the biggest lesson here is just to be patient. I think his story is very, very touching, and it's easy to relate to his feelings of frustration when he first went to Tihama and was very unsuccessful in trying to convert people, but Muhammad ﷺ encouraged him to be patient and made dua, and eventually the entire tribe embraced Islam with Allah's help, of course. So I think we'll end here, and one more chapter to go, guys. Alright, Assalamu alaikum, barakallahu li wa lakum.